too. Bank tellers are universally told to give it up, to be observant, but give them whatever. They're instructed to give, a certain amount first, give the smaller bills first, and if they say, I want it all, bitch, or whatever, you go and take the rest of the drawer contents and give it to the perp. But in many, if not most, bank robberies, and there's something like 9,500 bank robberies in 1992, there's no weapon displayed. It's threatened, or I'll kill you if you don't. But it's a note-passing kind of robbery. Somebody comes in the bank, stands in line, waits until a note goes to the teller. They present the bag or some sort of container. They get some money. They put it under their coat. They walk out. The first notice that every other person, besides the two involved parties, know that there was a robbery is after the robbers left the facility. But the universal advice is give it up. And if that was one of the questions, are there any HR or legal consequences for giving it up when the chest wasn't open? I think, you may want to reiterate your positions on that.
Yeah, well, from an HR standpoint, we stress that safety is the most important part of this. And if they're acting in accordance with safety requirements or, I guess, trying to comply with the safety process, then we would back that up, and I think that's important.
And let me pass on as sort of an anecdote that some of you may be familiar with. As Barry said, bank tellers' advice is to surrender the loot. Also in convenience stores, that's a universal policy, and I think convenience stores are probably the most targeted places for robberies. You may have heard of an event within the past few months in Texas where a clerk at a convenience store ignored that policy and actually foiled the robbery. There was an individual who was displaying a weapon. There were customers in the store, and the clerk, through relatively heroic actions, was able to foil the robbery. He was hailed by local newspapers and TV stations and so forth as a hero. Shortly thereafter, he was also quietly dismissed from the company. And you may say, well, that's really odd. Why would a company do that after he was able to save the company's merchandise and the company's customers? And you may think that an awkward result, but in fact, from a liability perspective, he placed the company, the customers, and himself in greater risk by attempting to foil that robbery. And if you think beyond the initial, what looks like an awkward result, it is very logical that the company took the action that it did. And to reinforce what the whole panel has said, in situations where a customer engineer is threatened, by all means comply. It's consistent with company policy, and it's consistent with the most likely result of securing yourself.
Craig, I wanted to comment on your observation about attitude, security attitude, when you're at or around the ATMs also. And in the convenience store context, strangers have a right to be in your store and in your face all day long. And convenience store companies that are progressive with regard to security are telling their clerks, greet people when they come in the door. Afternoon, how you doing? Or if somebody's lingering in the back rows while a customer's checking out, you can always say, can I help you find anything? But the idea is that you're engaging them. And you don't have exactly the same role when you're doing engineering work on ATMs, but as you walk from the vehicle to a kiosk or drive-up ATM, a steady, 2-second eye gaze with somebody, with other people in the environment, lets them know that you are serious about what you're doing, that you are observant of what's going on around you, and certainly, as your earlier video showed too, your approach around the ATM after hours especially, and your observation of people sitting in parked vehicles nearby or people standing or loitering, even in busier downtown areas, is a signal that you're not a patsy. The person who takes this as the umpteenth late night call out that they've done in umpteen years and has tunnel vision, gets out of the car or van and focuses on getting to the back door or over to the island ATM without doing this visual survey, without making eye contact with people in the area, is saying, I'm not attending to what's going on and I'm going to be an easier victim. I like to think about the selection of victims to a degree in that wildlife video. When the lion is chasing after a pack of zebras. It's a very confusing image for them visual. It's designed to be that way, but they are able to target the oldest or the youngest or one who's lame or ill. They would rather pick an easy target of prey than one of the strong young ones. And similarly, although not all robberies can be deterred, if you demonstrate that you are alert, vigilant, and strong in that respect, I think you can reduce. If someone's wavering, and there are moments of wavering for the robbers too. Is this going to be too tough? Is this going to be easy? Am I going to get away with this? Am I going to get caught? If you can give them the impression by your steely, firm gaze on the way in, if someone appears at the last minute, that you know what you're doing, you know what you're about, and you are a confident and controlled person in this situation, I think you've done yourself a service.
I agree. Yes.
Guy's drinking coffee and he sees you pull a can out and set it in the floor right in front of him. He sets his coffee cup down, he walks out, grabs that can, takes off and runs. What is our goal at that point other than to try to remember everything we can when the police show up? Do we have any guidelines as to who we call first, who we call second? Do we call NCR first and tell them that there's been a problem? Do we call the bank first that lost the money? Do we call the police first to have them come and so on?
Right. That's a good question. That question is pretty well documented in the previous videos as well as in the operations manual. But what it comes down to is it is your job as a CE performing that service to begin with to ensure that the cassette is as in as secure of a place as possible. But let's assume that we're at phase 2 and the snatch and grab has occurred and it's gone. You are not to pursue the individual. It's not your job to pursue. That's a different function than we've got now. Your job, basically, your responsibility at that point, with that situation having already occurred, is to obtain as much information as feasible that would be relevant to the investigation that we'll pursue. Description, time that it occurred, witnesses who may be in the store at that time, the car, the direction that he went in, types of clothes that he wore, she wore, whatever. Okay, and you gather all that documentation, and the first thing you do, of course, is you phone your management. First things first is you phone your management. Okay, management is key. Then management basically will also, now this is the next key person for notification is the law enforcement agency. They need to be so that we can get an investigator on site and create an incident report. Management will then notify the customer of whatever needs to be notified at that point in time. Remember also that you said a minute ago we lost their money. It's interesting. In our contract, we are agents of that customer. We are responsible for the liability that we've lost. Okay? Losing the money when it's outside the chest the way that we've done is not a burglary of the ATM. Typically, it would be considered a robbery of you as an individual because you now have had possession of this money. Not you as an individual.
Well, as NCR.
The whole is.
So NCR is responsible for the money,
NCR is
not
not
the
responsible for that
bank.
money, which is why we have these procedures in place that talk about why it's so critical of how we handle currency in all facets of servicing the ATM.
Curious, you mentioned all these things we're supposed to be doing, but wouldn't the first thing we'd be supposed to be doing would be put the rest of the money back in the safe and close it up?
Well, I made the assumption when you said this that the rest of the money was gone.
Well, there's 4 cassettes there in a lot of cases, and if you're working on a machine, depending on what you have to do to the machine, you might have all 4 cassettes sitting
Without
on
a
the floor.
doubt. I mean, without a doubt. To
So you're not going to see a whole lot if you stop to put 3 cassettes back in the machine and close it up.
Well, exactly. I mean, your
I'm
observation
just
is right.
thinking, but we would.
Let's assume it happens. Let's assume that, like you said, you have 4 cassettes stacked up. Why you'd have them stacked up outside your realm of control, I still don't fully understand. But if it did happen, you're right. Your first response would be to make sure that there was no further loss, and try to ensure that you capture all the data that we talked about earlier on. How do you do that? Perhaps you do it as you're standing there with the remaining 3 cassettes if they're the ones that are available. What we're trying to say is use a high level of common sense. Do not expose the liability any more than it's already exposed to begin with, which is why we didn't want to have it exposed. We want it to be contained as you pull it from the ATM, but keep it between yourself and the ATM. In a previous video, we talked about setting up a secured environment of how to set up an area. It's not universally applicable, but it does have some merit, when you're in certain scenarios. We ask you to do everything within your control to ensure that snatch and grab does not occur. But if it does, trying to get all the data that we talked about earlier on is very, very important. We do not want you pursuing the individual. And then, as you saw in the earlier video, the next thing that happens after that is notification to your manager that it has occurred, and then the process will follow from there.
Keep in mind also, there's going to be other sources of information that law enforcement is going to be able to gather from. Other people who may be customers in the store management. Most convenience stores nowadays have some type of CCTV surveillance, and those are all tools that will be used to gather source of information as the investigation progresses, in addition to the information you've been able to capture and report to law enforcement officials.
It's interesting too, John, you mentioned even when you painted the scenario for Greg, you said suppose you come up on the scene, there's a guy drinking coffee. Sort of relates back to what Barry said a few minutes ago, and that is you always have to keep your antenna up. And he was referring to the situation where you might be at an island ATM and you notice there's two people in a car not seem to be doing anything, or someone doing something on a payphone without really talking. That might be one of those scenarios that calls for really scrupulous review and investigation and keeping your antenna out and being aware of any kind of situation. Because if someone is seemingly standing drinking coffee without any real purpose, usually the standard routine is if you're in a convenience store, get a cup of coffee and go. You get in your car, you get on your way. That's a little odd, that somebody might be just standing there. You might ask yourself, what's that all about? And factor that into the manner in which you're doing your job.
One other thing too, and I think we've discussed this before or in other situations. Our MSSS program is being rolled out in various portions of the United States in a time phase type of environment. And right now, as CEs and service personnel, we are in a migration of services of the way we used to conduct our business, and sometimes an escorted environment, or the cash replenisher or was there to guard the chest, to guard the assets. But now we're going to a single source environment, which is a total new environment for us. And what we're trying to do here today, and what we've done in the past video, is to give everyone who views those videos tools that can use to change your behavior. We can't tell you to change your behavior. Only thing we can do is give you tools and suggest avenues and methods and means that you can apply to yourself to cause you to be a smarter person, so your behavior can be changed. Thus, you're working in a more safe and secure environment.
It's possible to influence your environment in other ways too. A lot of times when you arrive at a scene, if you've got the coffee drinker as a, kind of a gray zone person, it doesn't appear to be an imminent threat, but it's a little out of the ordinary. I've heard of people, whether they're bank security guards or others, when somebody comes with a delivery, to say, this guy, telling a clerk in the store, for example, I'd like to service that ATM, but I'm unable to do so with that man standing right next to a drink of coffee. Could you ask him to move or leave, kind of thing? Or you can do that yourself. You don't. I guess my point is this: you don't have to take the scene cards the way they are dealt you. You may be able, if it's a human part of the environment, you may be able to influence that somewhat, or you can say, no, I'm not going to do it now. Those are some of the other choices. But if it's just, a guy who comes in and this is his a 70-year-old guy who comes into the C-store, this is his outing for the day, he shuffles on in, he shuffles on home, it may not be a risk. But if it's a 20-something guy with nervous eyes and a ball cap on, it represents a different level of concern for you. So you got to make those assessments. Nobody can tell you exactly how these situations are going to turn out, but you got to be aware that there may be different risks associated with each one of those, and you may be able to influence some of those circumstances. If there's somebody standing nearby or appears and comes over and looks over your shoulder while you're doing servicing, you say, I'm sorry, you can't stand here while I've got the machine open. It's regulations. But you have some control. You don't have to kneel there and perspire while you feel somebody looking over your shoulder. You can close it up and say, I can't continue with you doing this, or leave the store. But you do have some control over elements of the scene. Or if you get a bad vibe, no explanation necessary, slam it shut and go. I'm not speaking for you, Greg, but I'm saying
You're
this is
100%
how it
correct.
gets, yeah.
You had mentioned
Yes.
earlier, Barry, when you were talking about the Evansville, Indiana situation, I think it was, that the person servicing the vault had a bad feeling even while he was down there.
Yeah.
And all of us have been there. I mean, you have a sense of imminence that something's not quite right. You know, and I think what Barry and all of us are saying is act on those feelings.
Yeah, Luke Skywalker said it, didn't he? You know, let the Force guide you. But if you pick up the Force, the bad forces out there, Darth Vader's lurking somewhere, act on it. That's what I think is being suggested here. Don't wait until you hear that, you know, over your shoulder and see the big black cape and the whole thing.
Let's take a short break now. These have been some fantastic questions you guys levied at us, but let's take a short break, come back in a few minutes, and we'll focus on questions relating to legal, human resources, and policy issues. Thanks a lot.